What if I told you that the terrifying events shown in The Conjuring were not just scenes from a movie, but a chilling reality? Imagine moving into a house, believing it's your family's dream home only to discover that the walls themselves whisper. The darkness hides something watching, and every night feels like a countdown to the unknown. Tonight we dive deep into the real story of the Perron family. The family who lived through a nightmare that became one of the most famous hauntings in American history. This is not just a ghost story. This is a true haunting, darker and more disturbing than Hollywood could ever show you. So stay with me until the end, because once you hear what happened inside that farmhouse, you will never look at the dark the same way again. It was the winter of 1970 when Roger and Carolyn Perron thought they had found their dream home. A sprawling, centuries-old farmhouse in Harrisville, Rhode Island, surrounded by acres of land, whispering woods, and the stillness of rural America. For them and their 5 daughters, it was supposed to be a fresh start. A place of peace, laughter, and family memories. But as history has shown us, sometimes the places that look most serene hide the darkest of secrets. The Perrons were a simple family. Roger, hardworking and devoted, wanted nothing more than to provide stability. Carolyn, loving but sensitive, always had a quiet intuition about things. And the 5 young girls, Andrea, Nancy, Christine, Cindy, and April, were full of innocence, unaware that their childhood home was about to become a stage for one of the most disturbing hauntings in American history. The farmhouse stood since the 1700s, its wooden beams carrying centuries of whispers, births, deaths, and tragedies. To the Perrons, it was charming, rustic, alive with history. To the locals, it was infamous. People in the town spoke in hushed tones about strange things that had happened on the property over the years. But the Perrons didn't know, or perhaps didn't want to know. After all, who would willingly walk into a nightmare? The first night seemed ordinary. The children explored, running through hallways that creaked beneath their feet. Carolyn decorated the rooms, bringing warmth into the old house. Roger fixed what needed to be fixed, believing they had finally settled into a home where their family could grow. But almost immediately, small things began to happen. At first, it was subtle. A broom would go missing, only to be found in another room. Carolyn would sweep the kitchen floor, place the broom against the wall, and minutes later, it was gone. Doors creaked open on their own. Strange drafts swept through rooms where no windows were open. Shadows seemed to linger longer than they should. And at night, faint whispers echoed down the halls, so soft that the girls sometimes thought they were just imagining them. But Carolyn knew something wasn't right. She felt it in her bones. It was as if the house itself was alive, watching, waiting. Sometimes, while folding laundry or cooking dinner, she would feel a presence behind her. A cold sensation, like eyes staring through her skin. When she turned, no one was there. The children began to notice too. Andrea, the eldest, recalled waking in the middle of the night to the sound of footsteps pacing her room. Slow, deliberate, heavy like boots dragging across old wood. But when she called out, the room remained empty, the silence heavy with dread. Her sister Christine once whispered, "Mom, something in this house doesn't want us here." Still, the family tried to dismiss it. Perhaps it was an old house settling, perhaps nerves, but the activity grew bolder. Knocks began echoing through the walls. Not random knocks, but patterns, rhythms, 3 sharp knocks at a time, over and over. And in many traditions, especially in Christianity, 3 knocks are considered a mockery of the Holy Trinity. Was it coincidence, or something darker making itself known? One night, Carolyn was awakened by the sound of rustling in the kitchen. She crept downstairs, expecting to find one of the girls sneaking a late-night snack. Instead, she found the kitchen chairs rearranged in a circle, every single one, facing the center as if something had been conducting a meeting in the dark. The air was cold, her breath visible. And in that moment, Carolyn realized they were not alone in this house. From then on, the haunting grew stronger. Each daughter began to experience her own terrifying encounters. Cindy would wake screaming, convinced that something was crawling into her bed. April spoke of a little boy she claimed to see in the corner of her room, always watching, never speaking. And Andrea began to see figures, dark silhouettes moving in the corners, appearing and vanishing like smoke. But the most chilling of all was what Carolyn herself endured. The house seemed to target her. Bruises appeared on her body, dark, circular, as though invisible hands had gripped her with force. She would wake feeling drained, weak, her skin icy cold. Sometimes she felt a pressure in her chest, as if something was pressing down, trying to suffocate her. Whatever inhabited the house, it had chosen her as its victim. The farmhouse's history began to reveal itself. Neighbors whispered of tragedies, of suicides, murders, drownings, and children who had mysteriously died on the property. And at the center of many of these stories was a name the Perrons would come to fear: Bathsheba Sherman. Bathsheba was a woman who had lived in the house in the 1800s. Rumors spread that she was a witch, that she had sacrificed her own child to the devil. She was accused, though never formally convicted, but the stories lived on. Locals believe she cursed the land, binding herself to it even in death. And now, it seemed, she had set her sights on Carolyn. As nights turned into months, the Perrons' dream home became a prison. They were trapped in a nightmare that only escalated with each passing day. Lights flickered, objects levitated, doors slammed with violent force, and always, that sense of being watched. As if something inhuman lingered just beyond sight, waiting for its chance to strike. And yet, this was only the beginning. By the spring of their first year inside the farmhouse, the Perron family's life had already been twisted into something unrecognizable. The small disturbances, the missing broom, the whispers in the night were no longer subtle, they were violent. And now, the unseen forces inside that house began to attack the family openly, especially Carolyn. The bruises on Carolyn's body grew worse. Some appeared while she was awake, as though invisible hands had struck her. Others surfaced overnight, leaving her with the terror of wondering what might have happened while she slept. She would sit at the breakfast table, her daughter staring at her arms, her face pale with exhaustion. Roger tried to dismiss it as stress, but deep down even he knew something was attacking his wife. The children too were suffering. Cindy was plagued by nightly terrors, waking in screams, insisting that voices were telling her that 7 dead soldiers were buried in the walls of the house. Andrea, the eldest, began keeping a secret journal, writing down every incident, afraid that if she didn't, people would think she had lost her mind. Christine claimed she was being touched, her hair pulled, her legs grabbed by something that was not there. And April, the youngest, continued to talk to her so-called friend, the spirit of a little boy. But while April believed he was harmless, the others feared what might truly be behind that innocent facade. Then there was Nancy. She often felt followed, chased down hallways by footsteps that did not belong to any living being. Sometimes she'd run to her room, slam the door, and press her back against it, only to hear heavy breathing on the other side. Slowly, the 5 girls began to realize they were prisoners in their own home. At the center of the storm always seemed to be Carolyn. One night, while folding laundry in the living room, she felt a sharp pain in her leg. She looked down, and to her horror, she saw a puncture wound, as if stabbed with a needle. The searing burn ran up her body. She cried out in agony. When she told neighbors what happened, one old woman looked at her gravely and whispered, "That was Bathsheba. She hated other mothers. They say she cursed the land to see any mother suffer." The Perrons had now learned the stories. Bathsheba Sherman accused of witchcraft, believed to have murdered her infant. rumored to have worshipped Satan. Some claim she had hanged herself in the barn after cursing the property forever. The legend was so powerful that even locals avoided the farmhouse, calling it the House of Death. And now, Bathsheba's spirits seemed to have chosen Carolyn as her target. But why? Some believed it was jealousy. Bathsheba, unable to care for her own child, despised Carolyn for being a mother of 5. Others whispered that Bathsheba wanted Carolyn gone so that she could claim the family's children for herself. Whatever the truth, Carolyn's torment grew unbearable. She grew thin, weak, her eyes hollow. She would spend hours in silence, staring into corners of the room as if something stood there, whispering to her. Roger tried everything: prayer, logic, even considering leaving the farmhouse. But money was scarce and selling the property wasn't easy. They were trapped. It was then, in desperation, that the Perrons reached out for help. And that help came in the form of 2 names that would later become legends in the world of the paranormal: Ed and Lorraine Warren. The Warrens were not strangers to fear. By the early 1970s, they had already investigated dozens of hauntings across the United States. Ed, a former Navy man, was a self-taught demonologist. Lorraine, his wife, claimed to be clairvoyant, a sensitive who could see and feel the presence of spirits. Together, they had dedicated their lives to confronting what others were too afraid to face. And when the Perron's story reached them, they knew this was no ordinary case. The first night the Warrens arrived, the farmhouse seemed to come alive. Lorraine immediately felt a suffocating energy, like a thick fog pressing down on her chest. She later described it as a darkness that wanted to consume. Ed walked through the rooms with quiet determination, listening to the accounts of the family, studying the layout of the house. The children clung to their parents, whispering about the things they had seen. And Carolyn seemed almost detached, her voice trembling as if she had already lost part of herself to the entity haunting her. The Warrens began their investigation. Lorraine claimed she saw a figure woman with a twisted neck, head drooping unnaturally to one side, eyes black and filled with rage. She believed this was Bathsheba. "She's here," Lorraine whispered, "and she wants this family gone." Ed and Lorraine advised the Perrons to stay strong, to pray, and to document everything. They explained that what the family was experiencing wasn't just a haunting, it was oppression. A slow, systematic attempt by a demonic presence to weaken Carolyn, to break her will, and to ultimately possess her. The nights that followed were among the most terrifying of the Perrons' lives. The house seemed to resist the Warrens' presence. Doors slammed shut violently. Temperatures dropped suddenly, their breath turning visible even in summer. The smell of rotting flesh filled hallways, then vanished, and Carolyn's behavior grew stranger. Sometimes she would fall into trances, her voice changing, her body convulsing, as if something inside her was trying to take control. One night, during a séance led by Lorraine, the haunting reached its peak. Carolyn began to scream, her chair lifting off the floor, her body thrashing violently as if invisible hands were dragging her. The children cried out in terror as Roger tried desperately to hold his wife down. Ed and Lorraine prayed, their voices trembling, as Carolyn was thrown across the room by a force no human eye could see. It was then the Warrens were certain. This was no ordinary haunting. This was a battle with something inhuman. And Bathsheba Sherman, or whatever evil remained of her, was not going to leave without a fight. And as the farmhouse grew darker, the Perrons realized a horrifying truth. This wasn't just a ghostly presence. This was war. The séance had left its scars. After that night, the Perrons were no longer living in a haunted house. They were living inside a battlefield. The walls, the floors, even the air seemed to tremble with something malevolent. And at the very center of it all was Carolyn. The days that followed were filled with dread. Carolyn's health plummeted. She grew pale, her skin clammy, her eyes sunken. The bruises returned, black and purple marks crawling across her arms and legs. Sometimes the marks looked like fingerprints, pressed deep into her flesh. Other times they resembled coils, as though ropes had been wrapped around her body and pulled tight. The children whispered among themselves. They didn't want to believe it, but they could see it. Their mother was changing. Sometimes her voice would deepen into a guttural growl, words spilling out in a language no one could understand. Other times, she would vanish into silence, standing for hours in the shadows of the farmhouse, staring at something only she could see. One evening, Andrea, the eldest daughter, awoke to find Carolyn standing at the foot of her bed. Her head was tilted at a grotesque angle, her lips parted as if she were muttering under her breath. When Andrea whispered, "Mom," the figure let out a rasping sound, then disappeared before her eyes. Andrea screamed, waking the entire house. But Carolyn herself was found asleep in her own room. Was it a dream? Or was Bathsheba using Carolyn's body as a puppet? The Warrens were now convinced. Carolyn was under direct attack. What had begun as oppression was sliding dangerously close to possession. Bathsheba, or the entity claiming to be her, wanted control. And if she succeeded, the consequences would be catastrophic. Ed and Lorraine tried everything: holy water, prayers, rosaries. Lorraine pleaded with Roger to let them perform an exorcism. But Roger hesitated. He feared for his wife, but he also feared the church. In those days, the Catholic Church did not easily sanction exorcisms. And worse, Ed explained, if performed incorrectly, an exorcism could provoke the entity into violence. The Perrons were trapped between two horrors, the haunting itself and the danger of trying to remove it. Still, the entity's cruelty grew. Furniture moved on its own, crashing into walls. The children were dragged from their beds by invisible hands. Doors locked themselves, trapping family members inside for hours. The smell of decay would appear suddenly, choking them, only to vanish in seconds. At times, they would hear screams, agonized cries that seemed to come from the walls themselves. But the most terrifying moment came one winter's night. Carolyn had been growing weaker, barely eating, barely speaking. That night, as the family gathered in the parlor, she suddenly convulsed and collapsed to the floor. Her body twisted unnaturally, her back arching so severely that Roger thought her spine would snap. The children screamed as Carolyn's eyes rolled back into her head. From her lips came a guttural voice, not her own snarling curses at the family. Lorraine tried to intervene, her prayers filling the room. Ed attempted to restrain Carolyn, but she lashed out with inhuman strength, throwing him across the floor. Andrea would later write in her secret journal, "That was not my mother. Whatever spoke that night, it hated us, it wanted us gone." In desperation, Ed began reading passages of deliverance, invoking the power of God. Lorraine shouted for the children to stay back. The farmhouse shook, lights flickering, the air vibrating with an unholy presence, and then silence. Carolyn collapsed, her body limp, her breathing shallow. Roger gathered her into his arms, sobbing, terrified he had lost his wife. But slowly she stirred, her eyes fluttering open. For a brief moment it seemed the nightmare was over. But Lorraine knew better. She whispered to Roger, "It's not gone, it's waiting." The Perrons realized then that their family might never truly be free. Bathsheba's spirit, or whatever dark force haunted that land, had claimed the farmhouse as its own. It would not leave simply because they wanted it to. Years passed. The hauntings never completely stopped, but the family grew resilient. They learned when to stay quiet, when to avoid certain rooms, when to pray. The Warrens continued to visit, offering guidance, but even they admitted the house was a stronghold of darkness. Finally, after nearly a decade of torment, the Perrons left the farmhouse. They had no money, no stability, but they had survived. For the first time in years, The children slept without fear of being dragged from their beds. Carolyn's health improved, but the memories never left them. Andrea Perron would later write, "We left that farmhouse, but it never left us." The Perron family's haunting remains one of the most disturbing cases in paranormal history. Some call it folklore, some call it hysteria, but for those who lived it, there is no debate. They endured something that defied logic, something that defied faith itself. And while the farmhouse still stands, quiet beneath the Rhode Island sky, many believe its darkness waits, patient for the next family to enter. By the time the Warrens had entered their lives, the Perrons were already living in a prison of shadows. But what many don't realize is just how relentless, how day-to-day their torment truly was. It wasn't just nights of terror. It was mornings, afternoons, every quiet moment of their lives. The farmhouse seemed to breathe. That's how Andrea later described it. The walls creaked even when the air was still. The floorboards groaned as if heavy footsteps pressed down, though no one was there. Every corner of the house had a story, and every story left scars on the family. The children began to recognize patterns. Cindy, the middle daughter, would wake up at exactly 3:07 every morning. No matter what time she fell asleep, no matter how exhausted she was, her eyes would snap open at 3:07. And every night at that time she would hear whispers. Not words she could understand, but soft murmurs like a conversation happening just outside her door. Sometimes she swore she heard her name. Other times it sounded like children crying. Nancy, another daughter, experienced something different. She would feel tugging at her hair in the middle of the day, sharp enough to make her yelp. At first she thought it was one of her sisters playing tricks. But when she turned, there was no one there. Once, her head was yanked so hard she fell to the floor, scraping her knees. When she screamed, the others came running only to find strands of her hair lying on the ground, torn straight from her scalp. But perhaps the cruelest torment was reserved for Carolyn. Her strength diminished with each passing week. She no longer laughed the way she once did. She moved slowly, like a woman carrying invisible chains. In the kitchen, pots and pans would leap from their hooks when she entered. In her bedroom, the mattress would dip beside her as though something was lying down next to her. She described the feeling of being constantly watched, constantly touched, as if she were never alone. The farmhouse was more than haunted. It was alive, and it wanted her. The Warrens returned time and again, documenting the occurrences. Lorraine, sensitive to the spiritual world, described the house as a cesspool of inhuman activity. She felt dozens of spirits inside, some confused, some angry, some dangerous. But one stood above the rest. A presence that loomed over everything, choking out hope like smoke in the lungs. That presence, Bathsheba. Witness accounts varied. Sometimes Bathsheba appeared as a shadowy figure watching from the doorway. Other times she revealed herself more fully, a grotesque woman, her head tilted, her skin sagging, her eyes burning with hate. Once, Andrea claimed she woke to see Bathsheba crouched over her mother, pressing her lips close to Carolyn's ear, whispering something in a voice too low to understand. Carolyn screamed in her sleep that night, but she remembered nothing by morning. The family tried to hold on to normal life. Roger worked long hours, desperate to keep food on the table. The girls still attended school, though their teachers noticed changes, sudden exhaustion, daydreaming, a quiet sadness in their eyes. They carried the weight of secrets no child should bear. Yet even outside the farmhouse, the darkness followed. When the children visited friends, strange occurrences happened in those houses, 2 books falling off shelves, radios turning on by themselves, lights flickering. It was as if the Perrons carried the haunting with them, shadows clinging like invisible dust. One particularly chilling incident occurred one winter afternoon. Andrea and Nancy were in the barn, playing quietly. Suddenly, they heard heavy breathing behind them, loud and wet, like an animal gasping. When they turned, they saw nothing, but the sound grew closer, circling them. The girls ran screaming into the house, and though Roger searched every corner of the barn, he found no trace of an intruder. Lorraine grew convinced the spirits were feeding on fear. The more terrified the family became, the stronger the manifestations grew. But how do you tell children not to be afraid when shadows move, when unseen hands grab them, when their own mother seems possessed? One night, Cindy broke down in tears. She told her sisters, "They want us dead. All of us. They told me in my dreams." The other girls tried to comfort her, but the truth was they had all heard similar warnings. Some in dreams, some whispered directly into their ears while awake. The farmhouse, once their dream home, had become a cage, and the Perrons realized there was no escaping it. They didn't have the money to leave. They didn't have relatives who could take them in. They were trapped, forced to live inside a nightmare. For Ed and Lorraine Warren, the case was unlike anything they had faced before. They had dealt with demons, with spirits, with curses. But here, in that Rhode Island farmhouse, they felt something greater. A network of spirits tied to the land, controlled by a singular dominant force. And that force would not let go without a fight. This was no longer just a haunting, it was a siege. And the Perron family, caught in the middle, were fighting to survive one more night, one more day in a house that did not want them alive. By the final years inside the farmhouse, the Perron family had stopped asking if the house was haunted. They knew. The only question that remained was how much more could they endure before it consumed them completely. The days blended together in a haze of fear. By now, every member of the Perron family carried a secret terror, something they didn't always share with each other. It was as though the house wanted to divide them, to keep them isolated in their fear. Andrea began keeping journals, writing down every strange occurrence. She was afraid the world would forget, afraid people would call them liars. In her pages, she described chairs moving across rooms, the sound of a woman sobbing in the basement, and the constant smell of rotting flesh that seemed to appear at random. She wrote about nights when the temperature plummeted so sharply that her breath came out in clouds even, while the fireplace roared with flames. Carolyn, once vibrant and full of life, had become a shadow of herself. The children often found her staring blankly into the distance, her lips moving as though whispering to someone unseen. Sometimes she would argue with this invisible presence, her voice low and angry. Other times she would fall into terrifying trances, her body stiff, her eyes rolled back, her breathing shallow. Roger tried to hold the family together, but even his strength was breaking. He argued with the Warrens, begged them to make it stop. Ed and Lorraine tried prayers, cleansing rituals, even a seance inside the house. But nothing seemed to weaken the hold Bathsheba had over Carolyn. That seance would become one of the most infamous nights of their lives. The Warrens gathered in the dining room. Lorraine later described the air as suffocating, heavy with an evil so strong it made her chest tighten. Carolyn sat at the table, her hands clasped, her body trembling. The children hid in the corners, peering out from behind doorways, too frightened to look but unable to turn away. As Ed recited prayers, Carolyn suddenly convulsed. A guttural voice poured from her throat, a voice that was not hers. She screamed, cursed, and then began speaking in a language no one understood. Her chair lifted from the floor, tilting back dangerously before slamming down. Andrea, who witnessed it, swore her mother's body was thrown across the room by an unseen force. The Warrens tried to intervene, but Roger shouted at them, dragging his wife away, furious and terrified. He no longer trusted anyone, not the church, not the Warrens, not even himself. All he knew was that his family was falling apart. After that night, the Perrons begged the Warrens not to return. But the spirits did not stop. Winter came again, and with it longer nights. The girls began to hear scratching sounds under their beds, like claws dragging along the wooden floor. Sometimes they felt something tug at their blankets, exposing their skin to the cold air. The shadows in their rooms were darker than shadows should be, thick, almost alive. One evening, Cindy ran screaming from the cellar. She had gone down to fetch firewood when she saw two glowing eyes peering at her from the darkness. She refused to go back down, and from that day, the entire family avoided the basement at all costs. Roger nailed the door shut, though they could still hear noises coming from beneath the house, thumps, growls, and the unmistakable sound of chains dragging. Years passed in this torment. The Perrons could not afford to leave. The farmhouse was their home, their curse, their prison. Every day they woke wondering what would happen next, and every night they went to bed wondering if they would survive until morning. But finally, after nearly a decade, relief came not through exorcism, not through ritual, but simply through time. In 1980, the Perron family gathered their belongings and left the farmhouse behind. They had endured 10 long years of terror, and yet they were never truly free. Even after moving away, the memories haunted them. Carolyn never fully recovered. Andrea carried her journals into adulthood, eventually writing the trilogy House of Darkness, House of Light, to preserve what happened. The other daughters told their stories in fragments, still afraid, still scarred. The house still stands today in Harrisville, Rhode Island. Others have lived there since. Some claim nothing unusual happens. Others whisper that the darkness never left, that it simply waits, patient for its next victim. The Perron family walked out of that farmhouse, but the farmhouse never truly let them go. And maybe, just maybe, it never will. The farmhouse still stands, silent and weathered by time. Its walls have seen joy, grief, life, and death. For the Perron family, it was a home but also a prison, a place where shadows whispered and fear lived in every corner. They carried those years with them long after they left, proof that sometimes a house is not just wood and stone. Sometimes it is alive. The Warrens would go on to investigate countless other hauntings, but even Lorraine herself admitted the Perron case was one of the darkest, one of the most dangerous, and one of the few that never truly found peace. To this day, questions remain. Was it Bathsheba Sherman's spirit tormenting the family? Was it something older, darker, buried deep within the land itself? Or was the farmhouse simply a gateway, a thin place between our world and something we cannot comprehend? No matter the answer, one truth lingers. The Perron family escaped the house, but the haunting never fully released them. And as long as the farmhouse still stands in the quiet town of Harrisville, Rhode Island, its secrets wait silent, patient, watching. Because some houses are never just houses, some hauntings never end, and the darkness that touched the Perron family may still be there waiting for whoever dares to step inside. And that was the terrifying true story behind the Perron family haunting, the real events that inspired The Conjuring. But this is just one chapter in the world of the unexplained. Now I want to hear from you. What story should we explore next? Should we uncover the truth behind Annabelle? Or the mysteries of the Enfield poltergeist? Or maybe a completely different haunting you've always wanted to see? Tell me in the comments below. Don't forget to like this video if you enjoyed it, and make sure to subscribe so you never miss the next chilling documentary. Until then, remember, sometimes the scariest stories are not found in movies, but in real life.